From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
There's hardly anything I need to say at this point, since most of you know who Neil Gaiman is. He was here last year to great acclaim. He's a good friend of mine. I'm really honored to be part of his program in a very small way. And without further ado, Neil Gaiman.
Hello. Thank you for coming. I hope I don't get too drowned out by helicopters. I was told that I couldn't really do a long reading or anything, but I'd love to do a very little one. And of course, am standing up here utterly bookless, which indicates the speed with which we've been sort of shuttled from place to place. Yes, somebody... So, this is a book called Anansi Boys. It's my first adult novel in 4 years. It's my first funny novel since I co-wrote Good Omens with Terry Pratchett about 16 or 17 years ago. And one of the things that made me want to write a funny novel was... I sort of assumed that having been the person who wrote half of Good Omens, people would assume that I could write funny books. You would. And then I wrote a bunch of books that weren't funny. And then I wrote American Gods, which is very big and very serious. In hardback, you could probably stun a burglar with it. And it won many shelf loads full of awards. And people went, oh, right, he's a serious writer. Which was fine, except that I'd find myself in conversations with people who had finally figured out how Terry Pratchett and I had written Good Omens. Very obviously, I had written a serious novel, and Terry had danced behind me like a little pixie, tossing jokes into the text and adding humorous footnotes. And I thought, I think it's time to write a funny book. So I'd had a story in my head called Anansi Boys since about 1996 and had actually borrowed a character from it for American Gods, which is why some people think this is a sequel to American Gods, and it actually isn't. It's much more like American Gods had as a special guest star a character from a book I hadn't written yet, which is a character named Mr. Nancy. And the reason I put him in is because he actually dies on page 1 of Anansi Boys. So I thought it will be, it will be nice. I was getting very fond of him and thought what a pity it was that he was dead before the book started. So I put him in this other book. And he's a god, as his son, Fat Charlie, learns at his funeral. And actually, he learns it a little bit after the funeral. And just finding the little bit, there we go. He learns it a little bit after the funeral in conversation with the next door neighbor, Mrs. Higgler, who explains to him that his father, from whom he has been estranged for many, many years, was a god, was Anansi the spider god. And Fat Charlie doesn't believe this. He says he wasn't a god, he was my dad. She says, you can be both. It happens. He says, well, hang on, if my dad was a god, surely he would have had magical, godly powers. And she says, how do you think he got away with not working for all those years? And he says, but if my dad had had magical, godly powers, why don't I have magical, godly powers? And she says, oh, your brother got all that. And really, it's a book about what happens when his brother comes into his life and makes it more interesting. And I think I wanted to write a book about families, about how to survive families, about the incredible embarrassing nature of families. There's all this stuff you get when you're a dad that you forgot because you only got it as a child growing up. So obviously my parents were embarrassing. And obviously my dad was extremely embarrassing. But I had assumed that he was the only embarrassing dad in the world. And that everybody else's dads were just sort of normal things. I had the embarrassing one. I was wrong. But it took having children for me to discover how wrong I was. The fact that if you talk to your kids when they're near their friends in the street, this is right up there with committing genocide on a small country in the list of bad things that you can do. It was the point where my daughter would make me park around the corner from the school to let her out because my car was embarrassing, and turn off all music in the car before she got out in case any of her friends walking past heard anything I was playing, because that was embarrassing too. And I realized it was this flash of understanding. I thought all families are embarrassing. It's absolutely all about embarrassment. And it's about surviving your family despite that. And this is really the book I wrote. But one of the things that was the most fun for me about writing this book was getting to write a few Anansi stories. And Anansi stories are initially West African stories, and they spread all over the world, and they were about this spider who also happened to be a person called Anansi, and he was a trickster and a cool trickster god, but he was also the butt of everybody's jokes, and a lot of the stories got to translate into the modern world as Brer Rabbit stories. They're sort of remembered as Brer Rabbit stories, mainly because the next tribe up told the same set of stories about a rabbit instead of a spider. But they've spread all over the world, and one of the really fun things about the book for me was researching old books of folk tales and seeing versions of stories that one hadn't seen before, and then deciding to tell them in my own way. So I thought I would read an Anansi story, which is really nothing like the rest of the book, which is filled with ghosts and screwball comedy and romance and thrillers and a would-be serial killer and evil flocks of birds and things. But every now and again, you get an Anansi story, and that's what I'm going to read you. Here's another story they tell about Anansi. Once, long, long ago, Anansi's wife planted a field of peas. They were the finest, the fattest, the greenest peas you ever did see. It would have made your mouth water just to look at them. From the moment Anansi saw the pea field, he wanted them. And he didn't just want some of them, for Anansi was a man of enormous appetites. He didn't want to share them. He wanted them all. So Anansi lay down on his bed, and he sighed long, long, long and loud, and his wife and his sons all came a-running. "I'm a-dying," said Anansi in this little weeny, weedy, weaky voice, "and my life is over and done." At this, his wife and his sons began to cry hot tears. In his weensy, weak voice, Anansi says, "On my deathbed, you have to promise me 2 things. Anything, anything," says his wife and his sons. "First, you got to promise me you will bury me down under the big breadfruit tree." "The big breadfruit tree down by the pea patch, you mean?" asks his wife. "Of course that's the one I mean," says Anansi. Then, in his weensy, weak voice, he says, "And you got to promise something else. Promise me that, as a memorial to me, you're going to make a little fire at the foot of my grave. And to show you ain't forgotten me, you're going to keep the little fire burning and not ever let it go out." We will," said Anansi's wife and children, wailing and sobbing. "And on that little fire, on that fire, as a mark of your respect and your love, I want to see a little pot filled with salt water to remind you all of the hot salt tears you shed over me as I lay dying. we shall, they wept. And Anansi, he closed his eyes, and he breathed no more. Well, they carried Anansi down to the big breadfruit tree that grew beside the pea patch, and they buried him 6 feet down, and at the foot of the grave they built a little fire, and they put a pot beside it filled with salt water. Anansi, he waits down there all the day, but when night falls, he climbs out of the grave, and he goes into the pea patch, where he picks him the fat, sweetest, rippest peas. He gathers them up, and he boils them up in his pot, and he stuffs himself with them till his tummy swells and tightens like a drum. And then before dawn, he goes back under the ground and he goes back to sleep. He sleeps, wife and sons find the peas gone. He sleeps through them seeing the pot empty of water and refilling it. He sleeps through their sorrow. Each night, Anansi comes out of his grave, dancing and delighting at the cleverness of him. And each night he fills the pot with peas, and he fills his tummy with peas, and he eats until he cannot eat another thing. Days go by, and we shall wait for the helicopter to go over a little bit. Days go by, and Anansi's family get thinner and thinner, for nothing ever ripens that isn't picked in the night by Anansi, and they got nothing to eat. Anansi's wife, she looks down at the empty plates, and she says to her sons, "What would your father do?" Her sons, they think, and they remember every tale that Anansi ever told them. They go down to the tar pits and they buy them 6 penny worth of tar, enough to fill 4 big buckets, and they take that tar back to the pea patch. And down in the middle of the pea patch, they make him a man out of tar. Tar face, tar eyes, tar arms, tar fingers, and tar chest. It was a fine man, as black and as proud as Anansi himself. That night, old Anansi, fat as he has ever been in his whole life, he scuttles up out of the ground and, plump and happy, stomach swollen like a drum, he strolls over to the pea patch. "Who are you?" he says to the tar man. The tar man, he don't say one word. "This is my place," said Anansi to the tar man. "It's my pea patch. You better get going if you know what's good for you." The tar man, he don't say one word. He don't move a muscle. "I'm the strongest, mightiest, most powerful fellow there is, or was, or ever will be," said Anansi to the tar man. "I'm fiercer than lion, faster than cheetah, stronger than elephant, more terrible than tiger." He swelled up with pride at his power and strength and fierceness, and he forgot he was just a little spider. "Tremble," said Anansi, "tremble and run." Tar man, he didn't tremble and he didn't run. Tell the truth, he just stood there. So Anansi hits him. Anansi's fist, it sticks solid. "Let go of my hand," he tells the tar man. "Let go of my hand, or I'm going to hit you in the face." Tar man, he says not a word, and he doesn't move the tiniest muscle, and Anansi hits him, bash, right in the face. "Okay," says Anansi, "a joke's a joke. You can keep hold of my hands if you like, but I got 4 more hands and 2 good legs, and you can't hold them all, so you let me go and I'll take it easy on you." The tar man, he doesn't let go of Anansi's hands, and he doesn't say a word, so Anansi hits him with all his hands and then kicks him with his feet, one after another. "Right," says Anansi. "You let me go, or I bite you." The tar fills his mouth and covers his nose and face. So that's how they find Anansi the next morning, when his wife and his sons come down to the pea patch by the old breadfruit tree, all stuck to the tar man and dead as history. They weren't surprised to see him like that. Those days he used to find Anansi like that all the time. I was actually tempted to read the hangover scene that I did last year, if only because the delight of watching the person signing doing the hangover scene was one of my favorite bits of last year's festival. But I didn't. So, let's see. Why don't we do questions? Let's find out what you want to know, and I can answer things. There are mics on each side, but there you go. What would you like to know?
Yes, I was wondering, when you write a novel, how similar is the first draft to the last draft?
What a good question. Okay, how similar is the first draft to the last draft? They tend to be very similar except for all the important things. Writing a novel, for me, tends to be almost like the process of throwing mud at a wall and seeing what shapes it makes, and then going, you know, that really looks like a face over there, and throwing some more mud. And then the second draft is the process of going in and making it look like you knew what you were doing the whole time. And I tend, when I originally started writing novels, I would write my novels as on the computer. And I never really felt I had any difference between drafts. I just had a first draft that got better and often got bigger. So part of the fun for me now is I go out when I start a new novel and I buy some fountain pens and I buy some big old notebooks and I write novels by hand. And this means two important things. One, nobody can send me email while I'm writing or pop-up messages, and I cannot suddenly decide to look up a word while I'm writing and find myself 4 hours later in the middle of some eBay auction that the Google search led me to. If I'm sitting there, it's me and a notebook, I'm just going to have to go and look it up in a dictionary. So there's that. And there's the fact that once I finished it, I then get to sit down and start typing. And I know the shape of the thing, and I know how it ended, and I can decide what to throw out, and I can look at it. And then that draft is what goes to my editor. And in the case of Anansi Boys, I wrote maybe an additional 4 scenes after it came back from my editor, mostly because there were characters she really liked that she didn't feel got enough, for want of a better word, screen time. So I wrote some more scenes about them. Maeve Livingston got 3 extra scenes because my editor liked her. Yes?
Okay. My question is, what got you interested in writing about all the gods of the world? I've read your Sandman series, so that's a very interesting book to me. Your writing style just really connects, I think, with a lot of people. And I also wanted to know what character out of that series you feel reflects you, Neil Gaiman, the most.
Okay, how did I get started writing about gods? What made me want to write about gods? Mostly, it's an analogy I've used before, but myth is just one of those things that I love. It's been something that I've loved since I was a tiny child. I don't see them making friends like that, but anyway. An awful lot of people who will be inclined to go, yes, we're with you, are suddenly going, oh, stop doing that. Sorry. When I was a little kid, I was the kind of kid whose most precious possessions were things like the Roger Lancelin Green Tales of the Norsemen and Tales of Ancient Egypt. I loved this stuff. It resonated with me in a way that I could not explain, could not describe, only know that it does. And I think that's just who I am. You know, if you put me and John Grisham and Stephen King in the same woods, in front of the same little hut, in front of the same little lake, and told us, you know, what do you get from this? You know, Grisham would probably write about the young lawyer fleeing the mob who winds up holing up in that little hut, and Steve King would write about the thing that comes out of the lake and eats everybody, and I'd talk about how the house gets up on chicken legs and walks away. And that's just because of who we are. As for who's me, they probably all are, in some way or other. You know, the way that as a writer you write characters who are believable, who are important, who matter, at least for me, is to go and find that bit of you that's them. You know, for me, in Anansi Boys, you know, the joy of the 2 lead characters, of Fat Charlie and of Spider, his incredibly cool brother, is Fat Charlie is me on a normal day. You know, we all do the Fat Charlie things, and it's the point where nothing quite works, and you trip over everything, and then you back into something, and then you stand up in a hurry, and something falls on your head. And then Spider is the other side, the cool side. and you get to be both. So it's really everybody. Yes?
I really enjoyed your novel that you wrote, Neverwhere. Fantastic.
Thank you.
That was my first novel that I read of yours, and I was just hoping that will you be in the future possibly writing either a sequel or something along that same vein, because it was just a fantastic world you created.
The trouble, I mean, there are two answers. One is yes, and the other is, but I cannot tell you when.
You can
I
email it
tend
to me.
to, the trouble with me is, and it really probably is a problem, I suspect I would be a much richer, with a much huger readership if I'd only just done one thing over and over and over again and still did it. But with Neverwhere, when I finished it, I plotted out a sequel called The Seven Sisters, and you get to find out where Dora's sister is, and you get to find out all about these very strange seven sisters of whom you meet Serpentine in the text. And I will one day go and write it, but there are other things that I've never done first, and I tend to get interested in things I haven't done. I also actually started a Neverwhere novella, which I got defeated by my own sort of fondness for writing in notebooks with fountain pens, because somebody gave me this gorgeous notebook as a gift with paper that actually had bits of flower petals in it. And they were incredibly proud. And I took this notebook away, which looked really beautiful, and I started writing a Neverwhere story called How the Marquis Got His Coat Back. And I got 3 pages into it and gave up because the flower petals kept clogging the nib of the pen. So I went off and wrote a story about Shadow called The Monarch of the Glen instead, which was in a book called Legends. And one day I have this 3 pages. It's a story. The first 3 pages are just a list of everything in the Marquis de Carabas's coat pockets, and how unlikely this is. And it's very funny.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was wondering, Sandman's always been one of my favorite stories of yours, and when you first started writing it, did you know where you were going with it, or did it just sort of run off and become this huge mythic tragedy?
Oh, I always knew where it was going. I mean, the nice thing about being a writer, but the part that's really, really hard to explain to people, at least for me and the kind of way that I write, you know where you're going. But you know where you're going in the same way that you would know where you were going if you said, right, I have a small car which doesn't run terribly well, and I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to drive it to Los Angeles. And I think I better take back roads because if it breaks down on a freeway, I'm going to be in trouble. And I'm not quite sure how long it's going to take. But you sort of know before starting out the places you're probably going to hit on the way. But you're never quite sure how long it's going to take you to get there. And you're not entirely sure. You don't know everything that's going to happen on the way. And, you know, the hitchhiker you pick up turns out to be incredibly important later on. And actually, sometimes that, I mean, with Sandman, it worked because I was telling it month by month. So I could always be working out stuff. With something like Anansi Boys, I got halfway through the book, and some people who were meant to be little more than animated window dressing promptly started lives and minds of their own and doing things, and that changed everything I had planned for the book. And suddenly it was that experience of going, this isn't going to Los Angeles at all, and in fact we'll be lucky if we wind up in Seattle. So, yes.
Okay, this is more a specific Anansi Boy question, because I was reading it yesterday. What in God's name is hair mayonnaise?
What is hair mayonnaise?
Yes, you listed.
It's a hair product.
What is it? I've been trying to figure out for like 24 hours what hair mayonnaise is.
Let me
I've been
just-
calling people like, do you know what hair mayonnaise is?
Did you try Googling it?
No, because I don't have a computer. I'm coming down from Philadelphia.
Does anybody here know what hair mayonnaise is? Is it one of these? See, look, a hand just went up. Anybody else know what hair mayonnaise? Yes, there are more hands, but not many of them. Good Lord.
Like, I called people to be like, do you know what hair mayonnaise is? And nobody knew.
I will leave it as your mission in life to find out. And once you have found out, go to my website, which is neilgaiman.com, and go to the frequently asked question thing and begin it with, I'm the person who asked about the hair mayonnaise at the National Book Festival, and now I found out what it is, and this is what it is, and then I will put that up on my blog,
Oh,
and you
thank
can
you.
tell the world. Yes.
As a question for a lot of new writers and stuff. When you first started, did you start off like writing like other people's ideas, or like other people's characters that have already been done, or did you actually create new characters first that also worked with the old ones? Like I think the whole thing with was it Mad Hattie or whatever in Sandman? She's like an older character, and
No, actually, I made her up.
She was
We've
cool.
just been flashed the 2 minutes left sign, so I have to give you a very quick answer. When I started writing comics, I mostly what I do is initially I started writing my own characters in a book called Violent Cases. When I came to DC Comics, it was a matter of sort of pitching them a project. So I took a very old character that everybody had forgotten called Black Orchid, wove her in with a bunch of DC Comics characters that I loved the idea of writing, like Swamp Thing and Poison Ivy, and sort of put it all together. With Sandman, I used a bunch of forgotten characters. I discovered the best thing to do with comics characters is take the ones that nobody cares about, because then nobody's going to come to you and say, actually, that character was just killed by the Joker, and he probably won't be back for 2 years. So really, it was a matter of just grabbing characters. But pretty soon, I was just doing my own stuff. And most of Sandman was my own. Occasionally, I'd go and find characters like Prez or whatever. But it was whatever was fun. The joy of being in a corporate sandbox is actually getting to play with their toys. Final question, I think.
First, I wanted to let you know that the interpreters are doing a fabulous job, and they're really giving life to what you are saying. But my question is that you have written novels, comic books, you're doing movies, and that really shows skill in a variety of formats. And I'm curious what the differences and the similarities are in the process for each of those formats, and how you decide what the story is going to be, if it's going to be a novel, a comic book, or a movie.
Okay. And this will have to be the last question, and get a reasonably... The honestest of all answers, there isn't such a word as honestest, but... is that I don't always. Sometimes it takes me a while to figure it out. Anansi Boys was an idea that I had in about 1996, as I said, and I had the scenario. I knew the father, I knew the sons, I knew what would happen. I didn't think that it was a comic. I thought maybe it was a movie or a TV play or something. And I tried writing 3 or 4 scenes just in movie script form, and it didn't really work, and I wasn't comfortable with it. And then I wasn't sure what it was after that, and I thought maybe it was a novella, and maybe I would do a book of... I thought maybe the book that Anansi Boys is would actually have been a book of 3 novellas, and I would have done like a Neverwhere novella, which probably would have been How the Marquis Got His Coat Back, and a Stardust novella about going to hell in a hot air balloon, and Anansi Boys. And when I started explaining this to my editor, she said, well, tell me the stories. And the first one I told her was Anansi Boys. And she looked at me with this glare. And she practically folded her arm and she said, that's a novel. And I said, I don't think it's going to be bigger. I don't think so. And she said, it's a novel. And you don't argue with editors if you're me, because they're terrifying. And she was paying for lunch. So I went off to start it as a novel with a sort of backup novel in mind in case it crashed and burned and went down in flames. And with that, I have to say thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.